to the Football for Kids podcast with me, Darren Rees. In this episode, we're going to be exploring a football club that have been through it all, from the risk of disappearing completely, to relegation battles, to being promoted, to sticking around for over a decade in one of the most competitive leagues on earth. Of course, in this episode, we're going to be talking about no other than Crystal Palace Football Club. First of all, let's do a couple of your shout-outs and your messages, shall we? First up is from Kingsley in Barnet, and Kingsley says, "Hi Darren, thanks so much for all of your podcast episodes. Me and my dad listen to your podcast every single night and on our way to watch the mighty Arsenal. We are season ticket holders and go to every home game and almost every away game. Please can you do an episode on Odegaard? Thanks very much, from Kingsley and my dad." Well, Kingsley and your dad, a shout out to you too. Thank you so much for being listeners of the podcast. And don't you worry, Odegaard is on my never ending list of episodes which I need to write. And the last one on this episode comes from Stateside and Washington, DC. "Hello Darren, my favourite podcast episodes have been on Ella Toon, Alicia Russo and Beth Mead. I love all the episodes you do. I play for a local team to me here in Washington in the USA, and I want to grow up to play for the USA national side when I'm older. Thank you for all the amazing stories and the inspiration. Harper, age 11 in Washington." Well, Harper, a huge shout out to you. Thanks very much for letting me know that we've got another listener over there in the United States of America, and keep doing your thing, and I'm sure you will go on to achieve great things. That's all we've got time for in terms of shout-outs and messages in this episode. If you want the opportunity of getting a shout-out or sending a message in, then you can either leave a 5-star review on Audible or Apple Podcasts, or head to the website www.footballforkidspodcast.com. Right then, let's get into it, shall we? On Crystal Palace Football Club. Firstly, Crystal Palace are one of the oldest football clubs in the world, and they were formed all the way back in 1861. That's 163 years ago as I record this. There have been 7 kings and queens of England since the club formed. That is how old Crystal Palace are as a football club. The club were named after a building called the Crystal Palace Exhibition Building. It quite simply looked like a big glistening palace which had 290,000 sheets of glass, which is where it got its name from. The glass building is thought to have been the world's first theme park. It didn't have roller coasters and waltzers, but a whole range of things on exhibition, with hundreds of thousands of people travelling across the world to come and see it every single year. That shiny old building, which once stood in South London, is a huge part of this story, and the story of the club overall. Back then, the people who were responsible for running Crystal Palace, the building and the theme park exhibition centre, constantly had to think about ways of keeping visitors coming back over and over again. They had to think about keeping things busy and keeping money coming into their business. So, back in 1857, there was a Crystal Palace cricket team formed, and it's known that in the winter months, to keep themselves fit, the cricketers in the Palace Cricket Club would play football. And this is when the Crystal Palace amateur football team was officially put together and formed. This wasn't just a Crystal Palace thing though. Many football clubs from over 100 years ago or more were formed off of the back of cricket clubs and cricketers keeping busy. If you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, then you probably would have heard many of the episodes on football history, some of the fascinating stories of matches from 150 years ago, and much more. If you haven't and you're not quite sure who the FA is, let me tell you, because Crystal Palace play a very important part in what we know football as today. The FA, aka the Football Association, was formed all the way back in 1863 on a Monday evening. Some gentlemen got into a pub and watched Monday Night Football on Sky Sports. No, obviously, I'm joking. But what actually happened is 12 people or so from a range of different football clubs got together in a pub near Holborn Tube Station. All of these clubs weren't quite playing the same rules as each other, and they decided that football needed some rules, some guidelines and directions for everyone to abide by. The clubs represented were not some familiar names that you all know of today. However, there is one name which sticks out in the list of football clubs, and that is, of course, Crystal Palace. They were there from the very start. They were a huge part of the Football Association and the early days. Anyway, that'll do on the deep history roots for now, but I thought it was important for you to understand how much history Crystal Palace have as a club. Palace eventually became a professional football club all the way back in 1905, and over the years there have been some pretty historic events. In 1920, they became one of the first teams playing in the official English 3rd Division, and they won it, becoming one of the very few teams to win the league on their very first try. In 1962, Crystal Palace welcomed the most famous club in football to South London and to Selhurst Park, who was obviously the Giants' Real Madrid. They came to visit with kings of the game like Alfredo Di Stefano, who we've covered on the podcast, and another player we've covered on the podcast, Ferenc Puskas. The game ended 4-3 to Madrid, and it was a cracker. Over the years, the club have gone up and down the football leagues, but their loyal fan base have been with them every step of the way. Football has a habit of causing some of the most memorable moments. Moments that bring adults to tears, rock bottom lows and all-time highs. Crystal Palace have had a fair few of these over the years, and those of a certain age may remember a game of the Darrens, which determined whether Crystal Palace would be relegated from the Championship or if they would stay up by the skin of their teeth. It was a 2009 to 2010 season. Crystal Palace Football Club were in a seriously tough position when it came to money and running the club. There was even a risk of the club completely disappearing. It was the final game of the season in 2010. If Palace lost, they were down, and the future of the club wasn't looking very good at all. Over 37,000 fans piled into Sheffield Wednesday's ground that day, all ready for a nail-biting game of football. If Palace lost, they were down and out. If they won or drew, that would just be enough to keep them up. And Sheffield Wednesday needed to win. A draw or a loss wouldn't be good enough, so they were going for it. Palace went 1-0 up thanks to Alan Lee after 23 minutes. Just before half-time, Leon Clark equalised for Sheffield Wednesday. 63 minutes gone, and Darren Ambrose put Palace 2-1 up. The Palace fans went crazy, until Darren Purse equalised for Sheffield Wednesday. They were back in the game. If Sheffield Wednesday had scored again, it would have been all over for Palace. Those last few minutes of football felt like hours for the Palace fans, for the Palace players and for the manager. The team defended with every little bit of energy they had left. They chucked themselves in front of every ball. They battled it out all the way to the final whistle. And finally, the whistle came. The game finished 2-2. Palace would stay up. Sheffield Wednesday were going down. Football could be brutal at times. Palace would be on the good side of it this time, and what a moment it was for the club and for the fans. Crystal Palace these days are known as the Eagles, and they play in an unmistakable vertical red and blue jersey. However, it hasn't always been that way. Palace many years ago used to play in similar colours to Aston Villa, and they were also known as the Glaziers. This is linked to those thousands of sheets of glass from the old exhibition centre, aka the Crystal Palace. But in the 1970s, Crystal Palace went through some changes, and they would then play in the famous red and blue vertical stripes, and an eagle would feature on their jersey. It's thought that an eagle was chosen as a sign to show the club rising from the ashes, a bit like a phoenix, and a sign of strength and resilience. Apparently, there's also a link and some inspiration from Benfica Football Club's logo. However, I'm not sure if this is 100% true. Palace play their home games at Selhurst Park and have done for many, many years. One day, I'll do a proper episode on Selhurst Park in all its glory, because it's a stadium which has so much history and has had so many special moments. I've also been very lucky to go to Selhurst Park on numerous occasions, and it's exactly what football is about. passionate fans and a modest ground full of people who love the beautiful game. Crystal Palace have certainly had their ups and their downs. They've had many a manager. The club has nearly gone at points, but they've been in the Premier League now for a very long time. They aren't just a football club, they're an enormous part of the community, and the history of the club, as you now know, runs very deep indeed. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you've learnt lots. So remember, if you know someone who loves football, especially if they're a Crystal Palace fan, then please tell them about Football for Kids. And whether you're playing football soon, watching it on the telly, or pitch side, I hope that you enjoy the game. See you next time.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
At your job, do you ever have to deal with a nose roller? How about a snub pulley? Well, if you're installing a new conveyor belt system, dealing with the different components can sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Luckily, you've got a team ready to help. Grainger's technical product specialists are fluent in maintenance, repair, and operations. So whenever you want to talk shop, just reach out. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.